Hello everyone, welcome to my first sketchbook tour. I've had a lot of sketchbooks over the years, but this is the first one I think I've ever actually finished all the way through, filling every single page, so I wanted to share it. I named this sketchbook Mud because of the origin of the word gouache. I was planning on using a lot of gouache paint in this sketchbook, and gouache comes from the Italian word guazzo, which means mud. I painted on the cover using acrylic. It didn't work super well. I decided to just kind of give up this interior drawing, which is just done in pen. I think turned out a lot better. So the first page does not feature gouache, actually. This is a sketch of my old living room done in pencil and just gray watercolor. Just an attempt to use only value and not worry about color. Kind of get my feet wet since I hadn't been painting seriously for a very long time when I got this sketchbook. And I think it turned out pretty well. Although if you do look closely at the upper right corner, you'll see that there's a little bit of a blue smudge. When I turn the page, you'll see why. That was an attempt at using Prismacolor markers on this watercolor paper. This is very thick, really good watercolor stock, and I like it a lot, but it unfortunately can't handle just how much Prismacolor markers bleed. I've kind of abandoned those as a tool as a result of that. So this one, originally on the left side, there was just a blue line, that kind of smudge across the top there. And after leaving it there for a long time, I went back and decided to just do a little watercolor painting over it to try to make better use of it. So I came up with this design. Not my favorite painting in here, but definitely better than just a blank page with a blue line on it. On the right side is one of my favorite paintings in this sketchbook. This is my first master study that I think I ever did, or at least that I would officially call that. It's a study of Ivan Shishkin's Noon on the Outskirts of Moscow, although I took some pretty major liberties with it, both in terms of the colors I ended up using and the actual subject matter. He just has some actual peasants walking down a road. It's very realistic. I decided to add a fantasy element to it because I'm a geek. And I also changed the figure in the foreground to a single figure holding some kind of a sword or something. And I turned the road into a river because I just thought it would be more fun to paint some water into here. And I think it turned out really well. I'm very happy with this. This on the left here is me testing out my Sakura water brushes, where you fill in a reservoir full of water and then you can use it kind of on the go. So I just tried it out with some watercolors just to get a sense of how it handled. They're really nice brushes, a great option if you want to travel without having to carry a lot of equipment with you. Paint on the go. On the right is a little fan art of Ms. Marvel, the Kamala Khan Ms. Marvel from G. Willow Wilson's series. Really big fan of that comic series. Probably the only superhero comic I've really followed in a long time. This was my attempt at seeing how I could combine line work using my old Micron pens and gouache. Results are pretty good. It looks a little strange in person because the ink is much shinier. It has a shiny finish, and the gouache has a flat finish, so the lines really stand out when the light hits it a certain way. And this spread here is just me testing out all my gouache paints once I first got them. This is not something I normally do. I know a lot of artists like to do little color cards and just kind of get a feel for things. I'm not usually that patient. I would rather just dive right into an actual painting. But since gouache was new to me and I hadn't had a lot of experience with it, and frankly it's pretty expensive and I wanted to make good use of it, I decided to just get a sense of how opaque it is, how the different colors look when they're layered on top of each other, and what it looks like when you mix different colors. So this page on the left is another attempt at using the Prismacolor markers. I was trying to blend them because I had heard about how you can do that with Copic markers, and you can't do that, as it turns out, with Prismacolor markers. Yet another reason I don't really use them anymore. So in order to kind of make the most of this page, once I had that little those lines on it, I decided to do this sort of abstract treatment of, I guess, rain clouds, sort of a rainstorm, in various watercolor colors, just to do something with it. And then on the right, we have another master study. This is a master study of James Gurney, one of his oil portraits that is in his book Color and Light, which is an excellent, excellent painting resource that I highly recommend. I wanted to get a feel for painting an actual human face and skin tone and some hair. Of course, I'm using gouache instead of oil, and I've drastically simplified the figure, partly because I'm new to this, partly because I'm not super patient, and I was also probably working a lot smaller than he was, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out for first pass. And the left here is me comparing gouache with casein. I had just picked up some casein paint for the first time, also on a Gurney recommendation. He's a big fan of the medium, and I wanted to see just how waterproof it really is, because it does become waterproof once it dries. But as you can actually see from my tests on the right there, it takes a little while for the waterproofing to really set in. Only the final block of paint at the bottom there, which has been left for a day, shows you any real sign that it's resisting the water once I try to reactivate it. So that was an interesting discovery. It doesn't reactivate as readily as gouache, but it definitely, you can't expect it to just completely stay down the way that acrylic often does once it dries. On the right, you see my first actual casein painting, which I'm still actually really happy with. I'm glad I stuck with a limited palette here, just to play around with sort of light and some very, very basic kind of warm and cool tones. I'm happy with how that turned out. On the left is some more experimenting with casein, trying to reactivate some paint that had been dry for a bit. Probably I will eventually go back and paint over this, because it kind of bothers me when I just have a few smudges on a page and nothing else to show for it. On the right is my attempt at mixing casein and gouache for the first time. So the background with those clouds is done in casein, and the little sci-fi airship in the foreground, which is also based on a James Gurney painting. I just wanted to see how I could lay that down on top of the casein, and it works pretty well. It's actually not a bad way to approach things. The left, I'm trying out gradients. I'm really a big fan of smoothly blending colors together, and this is a hard thing to do in water-based paint. So here I'm trying to do it just kind of very quickly, doing a lot of the mixing on the brush itself. On the right side is, I believe that's casein and gouache again. This is also a master study, but I can't find the artist's name who originally did the piece I based this on. I know that this artist works in watercolor and appeared in the Lines and Colors blog, but it's a long-running blog with a lot of watercolor artists on it, and no matter how much I search, I haven't been able to find this artist yet. So if I do figure it out, I'll put it in the notes below. The left is just a window and a table, kind of an abstract representation. I don't know, not one of my favorite paintings. The right is based on a photo I took looking at the Chicago River from the Merchandise Mart at night. This is one of my early attempts at really capturing kind of glowing light against a dark backdrop with paint. And I definitely struggled with it a bit. I think the painting is actually not bad, but it's not what I was hoping it would look like. I was going for something a little bit more photorealistic, and this ends up looking a bit more stylized. The left side is somewhat Magritte-like treatment. Definitely one of my favorite artists for a very long time. This wasn't like a conscious attempt to ape his style, but it just kind of reminds me of some of his work. In this case, I'd painted the background in casein, and I just left it there for a while, kind of waiting for some inspiration about what to paint over it, and then I went over and created that window with the sky in the background in gouache. The right side here is another pre-primed page. I had put down that sort of orange and red mix in casein and let it sit for a bit until I thought of something I wanted to paint over it. And in this case, I wanted to try experimenting with colored pencil, which I had just started using a bit more extensively. These are oil-based Faber-Castell pencils, the Polychromos line. Was experimenting with blending those using solvents, which can give you a really cool painterly effect. And I wanted to see how well I could combine that with paint, and as you can see, the result is not super well. The left side is a pre-primed page that I've still never done anything with. I kind of just really like that intense purple, so it's just sort of remained there as an abstract little piece. If I can ever think of anything to paint over it, though, I might go for it. The right side is another attempt at plein air painting, although this was indoors, so I don't know if that counts. This was at a crafting for coders night that I went to, where a bunch of people who work in software development kind of get together and just work on their various crafts. That might be knitting, that might be putting together various. One person was building like their own custom keyboard. And in my case, I was painting, which was fun, although I didn't have enough time to really get to the level of detail I wanted. So this is kind of about half of what I was hoping to get out of the painting, because time was just up and everyone was leaving. I also found that painting, unfortunately, it's not very easy to talk to people while you paint, so it wasn't great for the social aspect of the experience. But it was worth a shot, and I'm glad I tried it. This spread here is a whole bunch of me playing around with watercolor pencils, which I've had a set of ever since I was in high school, and I've barely touched. I only have a few colors. I wanted to get a sense of how well I could kind of layer the colors together to get to use the sort of primaries to bring out more possible hues. And I found out that while these are kind of fun to use, they don't blend super well. You can see the right-hand side of the left page. The results are very smudgy, very kind of muddy and dull. I was expecting that to be a lot more. I was hoping for some sort of brilliant purples and things like that, and I definitely didn't get that. I haven't really been using these much since, partly as a result of that. Here on the left side is me experimenting with white luminance pencil over black paint, just to try to see how well that worked. And then on the right side, some of my first experiments with blending colored pencils with solvents on this particular watercolor stock. I think that little sphere with the shadow under it worked out pretty well, but when I tried to draw a skin tone and I tried to draw a sci-fi city below that, I kind of started muddying up the colors a lot more than I liked. I wasn't very happy with the results I was getting, so neither of those are really finished as a result. The left side here is a little gouache rendition of the sky I saw coming home from work. I actually just tried to sit down and paint it as well as I could remember it, and I used a photo I had taken for reference. So it's very simple, but I kind of like how that turned out. There's some surprisingly subtle blending I was able to do. The right side is actually my first real success with blending colored pencils with solvents. This is all done with a Polychromos starter set. I think there's 12 pencils in that, and I used pretty much every pencil in the set. I was really happy with actually how the black background turned out. I was surprised at how well it blended and laid down a really solid dark black color, which is not something that's easy to do if you're just using pencils by themselves. The spaceship here is taken from an old Atari cover. I have the Art of Atari art book, and it's got a couple of really great pieces in there. And one of them is one of the versions, I forget which, I think the 7800 version of Asteroids. I just thought the way the ship was angled and designed looked really cool, so I took it as inspiration for this piece. On the left, more experiments. The clouds there, that kind of grainy look, that was me attempting to use colored pencil powder blender, which I had seen on a interesting set of YouTube art channels, which I'll link below. It's a very cool, actually, effect that came out of that, but it wasn't what I was intending. I was hoping to get very smooth, painterly kind of blending, and instead I ended up bringing out the texture of the paper in a weird sort of way. It turns out that you actually need to do that. You can only use the powder blender on an impermeable surface. Below that are just me playing around with my old watercolor set. I have a Winsor & Newton, a big set with a lot of colors, and I've had that for almost 20 years now. And I still haven't run out of the colors, which is kind of amazing. Obviously, a lot of those years I was not actively painting. But it lasts. It's pretty cool. So I was just getting back into that set and trying out some of the colors to see what they looked like. On the right side is a casein piece, a sort of sci-fi piece that just looked really cool in my head, and I couldn't quite get it down on paper, so I sort of abandoned this, but I'm interested to come back to it. It's definitely heavily inspired by an old Kupka painting, Resistance or the Black Idol. Actually, not a painting, an etching, I think, or a woodcut. Which you've probably seen before. I'll link to it below. It's a very cool piece. On the left is another master study. This is a Caspar David Friedrich piece. I think it's called Winter or something very generic like that. It's really cool. I just really love the mysterious way that church steeples kind of come out of the fog there, and how their shapes echo the shapes of the pine trees in the foreground. It's just a very cool composition. The right side is an attempt at mixing watercolor backgrounds with colored pencil character in the foreground and ink outlines, and it did not work. I was not happy with this piece, but it was a good experiment at least. I was considering, this is from a sort of somewhat animated video I did, kind of like an animatic / motion comic. I don't really have a great way to categorize it. I was basically trying to tell a story visually with sound and music, but not have to do a full animation to go along with it. So I'll link to that video below. Doing all the drawings for it digitally, I just meant spending a lot more time in front of the computer than I really wanted to. So I was curious if I could get some interesting similar effects with traditional methods, but I was worried about getting the colors consistent and things like that, stuff I'm not very good at, but is obviously kind of a no-brainer in digital work. So this was an attempt at doing a new panel with Jenna, the main character from the Silver Desert Scoundrels, which is what it's called, in the foreground here. But it was not a huge success, so I'm going to keep looking for other ways to get this effect. The left side here is a casein painting based on a screenshot from Horizon Zero Dawn, which is one of the prettiest video games I've ever played. I spent probably a lot more time in that game just taking screenshots than actually playing the game. The right side is based on a photo. This is watercolor, and I'm trying to replicate a really cool look of a photo that somebody posted on Twitter and gave me permission to use as a reference. I didn't end up finishing it. The original photo is of this little sort of pool with like water running down to it, and it has this amazing bright green glow as the sunlight interacts with the water. It's just hard to replicate, as it turns out, with paint. So I wasn't happy with how it was going, and I just kind of walked away from it, and I unfortunately haven't been back since, but I might try to finish it at some point. On the left side here, this is a piece that is in gouache that's very heavily inspired by Dark Souls. I think I was playing Dark Souls 3 and pretty deep into the game. I really do love, for the same reasons that I love Caspar David Friedrich, who was a huge artistic influence, I think, on that series. I do love these kind of ruins and the sort of, this kind of somber, dilapidated imagery that the series excels at so much. So I wanted to just kind of create my own piece. I didn't base this on any specific locales in the game, but if you've played the games, then this will, I'm sure, look very familiar to you. On the right side is another attempt at a screenshot of Horizon Zero Dawn. This one also didn't turn out quite the way I wanted it to. The screenshot is a lot of very subtle shading and blending of color. It's actually kind of very narrow tonal range. It just looks very cool, and it was hard to do this in paint. Again, I'm using water-based paint, and when you want to get these really smooth gradations between the colors, it can be pretty challenging. On the left side here is me playing around with Ecoline liquid watercolor. I've got some black watercolor. I was just testing it out, so I drew this kind of somewhat cartoony face and just kind of stopped drawing the face and started just painting black everywhere just to see how dark I could get it. It's a pretty cool tool. It's dye based, so I don't think it's light fast, which is something to consider if you're going to be using it yourself for any serious work, but it's worth playing around with. It's nice how intense you can get it if you're used to watercolor pans like I am, and getting a very deep, dark black color out of that, or any color for that matter, can be really challenging. The right side is my first plein air that I did actually out in plein air. This is the Chicago Lakefront right by Bryn Mawr. And I took just a pencil and some blue and yellow watercolor with me, and I wanted to keep things as simple as possible. I ended up struggling a bit to make the values correct here, because no matter how much blue I put down, it never seemed quite dark enough. Particularly that area with the trees and the little silhouette of the bicycle down there. I remember that being very dark when I was looking at it in person, and I just kept layering more and more paint over it. So it was a little bit tough to do, but I'm still happy with how this turned out. It's kind of a nice little composition, and it was fun to be outside and paint for the first time. It was very, very windy. That was a challenge. And this right here is probably my favorite spread in the entire sketchbook. On the left side is a gouache painting based on a photo I took when I went sailing in Lake Michigan in the summer. So just as the sun was going down, there were some really dramatic clouds coming up. Obviously, I took things in a more fantastical direction with this sort of serpent boat combination that you see here, because I like to have a little bit of fun with when I base things on photos. I don't like to copy the photo directly. I always like to add my own little touch. The right side painting is a painting of my daughter. She in this is accompanied by a little pixie fairy friend, and she's meeting an Alush, which is a Mayan mythological figure. They're sort of like little gremlins or elves, like kind of little trickster figures in that mythology. Basically, this is part of a series. The earlier version, the first version of which was also done in the sketchbook, but isn't here because it's hanging up on our wall right now. But basically, I wanted to show her meeting a little magical friend, and then I thought, what if every year I do a new painting and I add a new friend to the mix? So she kind of keeps meeting these magical little creatures and sort of amasses this whole group of magical friends. She's not old enough yet to have opinions about who she meets and which creatures I should include, so once she gets old enough, I'll definitely bring her in the process. But I thought this would be just a fun way to do a little series of paintings of her over the years. The left side here is me trying out golden high flow acrylic. I wanted to do just a simple composition with just black over the white of the paper. and I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. It's a really interesting medium to work with if you treat it like watercolor. It dries much faster than watercolor. You have a little bit of time to kind of play with it before it becomes waterproof, and then after that point, it's done. You can't reactivate it. You can't mess with it anymore. But if you do it in light washes, it has a really nice sort of texture feel to it. It's kind of hard to describe. I find it a little bit easier to control, and it has this kind of nice grittiness to it that's different from watercolor quite a bit. And then on the right side is just a simple watercolor painting. I just had this image of kind of a misty landscape sort of around dawn. The left side is the Golden High Flow acrylics again, and this time I tried doing a grisaille technique where I just established all the values of the scene first using the black on the white paper, and then I went over it with a watercolor glaze. And I'm reasonably happy with how it turned out. It definitely makes things much darker and sort of more desaturated looking than I was initially expecting. It's kind of like if you see old colorized photographs, it's actually basically the exact same thing as that. So if I do this again in the future, I might try blue or a brown as a base rather than just straight black. The right side is so far my most successful plein air painting experience. This is also Chicago Lakefront area. This is a little park between Lakeshore Drive and Sheridan Road near Bryn Mawr, and that is the Edgewater Beach Apartments there, that pink building in the middle, which is a building I've really liked for a long time. It's very striking. And I really like the way it looked from over this particular green field. It really stood out. So I set up a tripod, and a homemade easel, which was a James Gurney design that my stepdad, Bill, very kindly put together for me, just as a little fun project. And it worked really well. I did this in casein, and I was very happy with how it turned out. I forgot to bring a pencil, so I couldn't sketch things very easily. I ended up sketching them in red casein, just a very light. You can actually still see a little bit of it coming through on the building on the left. Here on the left is another master study that I did not finish. This is from an artist named Kathleen McAllister, who does these really cool digital paintings. And this particular one is of this sort of bizarre scene, and it's got a ton of color and glowing light and a lot of really cool interplay between the coolness of the sky outside and the warmth of these light sources on the interior. I was working way too small. I quickly realized, to try to get the level of detail that she'd been going for, and it was really hard to blend the colors like I wanted it to. Again, water-based paint. So I got about this far, and then I thought I would come back to it later, and I still haven't, which is, the story of sketchbooks to a degree. On the right side, underneath this painting is the beginning of another plein air painting that I did not finish. I picked an architectural subject that was way too complicated, and learned my lesson there that doing stuff with a lot of complicated perspective and receding lines is maybe not a great idea when you're outside and you only have a certain amount of time when the sun is up to your painting. So instead I painted over it, and this is a painting of my sort of memory, my immediate memory of the fields of Ohio and Indiana as we were coming back from a road trip. And it was really stormy overhead. It rained through a lot of the drive, but it was the middle of autumn, and it was very intense color out on the landscape, which was a cool contrast to the sort of steel gray of the sky. So I tried to capture that as best as I could in this painting, and it looks pretty close to how it does in my memory. And this is the final page. This is a casein piece I call Towers in the Highlands, and it's not really inspired by anything in particular. I just wanted to do something that had a landscape to it, but also a sort of sci-fi element, and I wanted to really try to give a sense of distance, having those tower colors kind of recede into the color of the sky as they get farther away, and I think it turned out pretty well. This is something that's a big focus of mine as I do landscapes, really trying to use atmospheric haze to give that sense of distance, which can be tough to do. It's a lot easier to do digitally, I find, than in traditional paint, so it's something I'm continuing to work on. And that is my sketchbook. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm currently in the process of filling up several more sketchbooks, so hoping to have a few more of these videos out very soon.